what are some of the differences between anxiety that we want we want to worry about to like kind of versus normal anxiety because that's part of being human.
Yeah, it's a good question because I feel like it's not about necessarily when we're talking about anxiety and not OCD, it's not the anxiety theme, it's the severity and the acuity of the anxiety. So when it's showing up and it's debilitating and your child can't move on and they can't function. So a lot of times it's the level of it because you have developmentally, it's normal to have fear, it's normal to have anxiety. There's environmental stressors that are going on currently. It's normal to feel stressful and anxious, but it's the level of anxiety I think that happens that causes that. And then I also think being proactive isn't a bad thing anyway. So even if because I think sometimes we split hairs of like, well, is that an anxiety disorder or is that just an anxious child because of developmentally, they're going through that. And either way, we can do things as parents to proactively help build resiliency and build an approach on how our kids deal with those struggles regardless.
What should we be looking for as parents?
It can differ in kids depending on their different themes, but I think if I was to say in general, you want to look for things that are debilitating them because we're talking about anxiety disorders
Mhm.
versus in, a sensitive child who is just a little bit more sensitive to the world. I mean, you can have both, but when you have an anxiety disorder, your child might be avoiding basic things. They may not be able to go to school, or they may not be able to go to the bathroom. They may not be able to go to bed on their own, way beyond what is developmentally appropriate. They may not be able to do their schoolwork without crumbling to a level that isn't kind of typical for that age. So when you're seeing it impact their social and emotional growth, I think that's a concern. And also physiologically, you get a lot of somatic complaints with anxiety. So if your child is having, tightness in their chest, or they're complaining about a racing heart, or they're having a lot of GI issues, you want to do a lot of rule outs because there's a lot of somatic issues. So constipation, and not that your child can't have any of these without anxiety for sure, but these are things that get missed. I think nausea and GI issues, migraines, things that can cause a lot of physical issues.
So constipation can be a sign of anxiety in kids?
It's definitely a red flag. So one doesn't equal the other,
Yeah.
but it's a weird correlation because your body's slowing down. And so it slows down a lot of times the GI tract. And so sometimes one of the earlier symptoms can be constipation because your body will either say, okay, we don't have time for this and release. And so you get like diarrhea, when you're in that kind of lovely, you're getting, that immediate like fight or flight response. But when you've been under stress for a long period of time, your body actually can slow down that GI tract, and so you get a lot of constipation because it's spending its energy in lots of different areas, and so the constipation becomes a common one.
Yeah, because your body if your body's in that stress response, in that fight, flight, or freeze response, it's like moving energy away from the rest and digest response, which is the opposite, and towards, like, the tightening of the muscles and the getting ready for action kind of thing.
Right.
Okay. Alright, so constipation, you said sleep issues, right? Isn't that one of them? A sign
Yeah.
of anxiety that we wanna look for? And what are we looking for there?
And sleep issues, and you can have, I just want to also like just stress again, you can have these issues without having an anxiety disorder, but these are
Yeah.
just things like when you start looking at the big picture, these are the things that might be little subtle indicators besides a child like balled up in a corner crying and being fearful, which I think is, what most people think of anxiety. They don't look for these smaller, subtle things. Um, Sleep is a very scary time for people with anxiety disorders because it's like a little mini 8-hour death. It's scary. You're like letting go of control. You're shutting your eyes.
Mm.
You don't know what's going to happen. And so a lot of different anxiety themes can pop up. Also, it's a really quiet time, so your anxiety has the microphone, and your brain is ready to give it its attention. So a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times you'll see sleep is a problem. Either they're scared to sleep, or they're wondering where their parent is at, or they don't want their parent to go to bed before them. Like there's a lot of rules around sleep, or there's a lot of ritualistic behavior around sleep, or they're afraid of bad guys. There's like just so many different themes that hit upon sleep.
All right. So sleep, signs in the body, and I think also you mentioned that hyper are like in smaller kids, like hyperactivity is a sign of anxiety, hyper arousal.
It can be.
Hmm.
Sometimes ADHD is misdiagnosed and it's actually anxiety, um, because when you're anxious, you can have a lot of jittery behavior.
Hmm.
So it's good to have a therapist who can rule out, who understands anxiety and ADHD. They are comorbid conditions, so you can have both very easily. But like my son, who's 11, he looks very hyper at times. When he is anxious and he's stressed, he's literally bouncing off the walls, like he's bouncing on the couch. And if someone was a fly on the wall, they'd be like, "Oh, that poor child, it definitely has ADHD." But you have to look at the pattern. He's only doing that when he's anxious or stressed. And so a lot of times you'll see that high activity level when a child is like hyper aroused, and overstimulated with anxiety. They might be hyper aroused, they might be defiant. I feel like a lot of times, especially not to stereotype, but sometimes more in boys, you'll see more aggressive, defiant, oppositional behavior. And if it seems like it's out of nowhere or it's uncharacteristic or it's not consistent and there's a pattern to it, sometimes that's a sign too.
So there's like fears, there's anxieties coming in their body, and so then they're acting out aggressively because driven by these feelings of fear or anxiety.
And a lot of times it's a parent request. So, and I'll give you an example. This is a
Mm-hmm.
really long time ago, but it's such a good example. I use it a lot. Um, my son had to go like empty the trash bins around the house, and it was like a very simple chore, and he was freaking out about it. And he's normally a pretty good helper, and so his reaction was very big. And I moved kind of in like mama annoyance mode, where I was like, honestly, like, you have to pitch in. But then I paused because he does have an anxiety disorder, and I said, well, what's the hardest part about, emptying these bins? And I didn't have any kind of condescending tone in my voice. I like wanted to know. And his answer was not what I expected. It's dark in those rooms. It was daylight, so it wasn't dark, but it wasn't what I was expecting. It's boring, or it's stupid, or why do I have to do this? Or I want to get back on my video game. It was an anxiety answer. So his opposition and his anger, which was escalating because I was escalating, it could have turned into like a typical parent-child moment where I like punished him and he like kicked something and went and hit. We could have done that dance,
Mm-hmm.
and we have, but for some reason I paused in that moment, and then he was able to reveal that. So sometimes I think kids who don't have good communication, I mean, even though he's like my kid, he did not articulate his feelings well at all.
Hmm.
Something I actually sent him to therapy for, someone who's not his mom to teach him. So a lot of our kids who can't articulate things, they're going to have that, fight mode when you are triggering their anxiety inadvertently and you don't know it.
Mm, okay. All right. And so you're able to step back in that moment and kind of check in with him. And, that kind of goes back to that whole idea of like kids who are acting badly or feeling badly. And so you're able to kind of like find out like, why is he feeling badly about this kind of thing? And that was a clue. Catch new episodes of the Mindful Mama podcast and other free resources, including the Mindful Mom Guide at mindfulmamamentor.com. You can listen to every back catalog episode, including interviews with Dr. Dan Siegel, Janla Van Zant, Sharon Salzberg, and get meditations, join our private Facebook group, and more. Go to mindfulmamamentor.com now. I'll see you there.